The views and opinions expressed during the drive time are those of Dave Glover and his guests and are not those of Northumberland 89.7. Agree, disagree, or have a comment? Call the station and speak with Dave live on the air. Call 905-372-2321. That's 905-372-2321. Now your host, Dave Glover.
Alrighty, well, welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited to have a great guest here, Clarity Whisper at Clarity Whisper on Twitter. Catherine Whelan Costen is my guest this afternoon, and we are going to be talking about Western Alienation. As I mentioned earlier, the anger is real. At least that's what the authors are telling us. This part gets me, and I mentioned this to Catherine before I put her on hold here. What has Alberta done to deserve being targeted by its own federal government? That's a question to think about as we take you out west. Welcome to the big broadcast. I'm so happy to have my guest this afternoon is Catherine. And Catherine Whelan Costen, she is an author. She hosts her own radio broadcast. She's a producer. She is a former politician, well, at least an attempted politician. I like to think of myself in the same sort of genre, really. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a pleasure. I always love to talk about Canada.
Well, I do too. You know, my family call me Captain Canuck. Who's Captain Canada over here? Everything's Canada with this guy.
Well, there's a lot to be passionate about.
There sure is. You know, I've had the luxury of being across this. The only province I have not been to in Canada so far is Prince Edward Island, and we could have done that last year, but I didn't want to pay to get off the island.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Well, I mean, we were all around it, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and been to Newfoundland, but I don't know. We just didn't have enough money in the budget to take the ferry back from
right.
the.
Well, that ferry is very, very wild. Well, when I was on it anyway, I remember that ride. The bridge is probably a little bit more fun, but.
Well, the thing that got me was they charge you more to get off the island than they do to get on the island.
Oh, how interesting.
It's very strange. Well, we've got you now. So, Western Alienation, I mentioned I'm going to read it again because every time I read it, I just go, yeah, this is insane. Monty Solberg, former Conservative cabinet minister, current principal at the New West Public Affairs. That doesn't sound like a political action committee at all. He said, quote, "What has Alberta done to deserve being targeted by its own federal government?" Now, I read that to you earlier. We both had a nice chuckle over it, but I like you, I believe, simply to use Mike Harris's words. I love using conservative phrases back at conservatives. As Mike Harris would say, I simply do not agree with the premise of that statement.
Well, the thing is, I find it really remarkable that we have a premier who came from Ontario, came to Alberta, dismantled the Progressive Conservative Party, created his own party in his own image, calling it United Conservative, very much like what Harper did to the federal Progressive Conservatives, created his own party with a very serious religious ideology thread running through it. And then comes to Alberta, and the premier, who was here at the time, Rachel Notley, an Alberta grown, knows the climate, the environment, and it's like Albertans said, well, we need this Ontario guy to come and tell us how to do things.
Yeah.
And it's such a slap in the face to truly Albertans who really love this province. And yes, oil is a big part of it, but the election was not a referendum on the pipeline. There were a lot of issues in this election that people didn't want to talk about and haven't talked about after the election. You know, this very strong religious movement that was, we didn't talk about all the candidates that the Scheer campaign had recruited. We didn't talk about it, but people knew. And it wasn't a fact that the Liberals did not reject the West. You had four premiers and the leader of the opposition posing like thugs on a Maclean's magazine, calling themselves the resistance against the federal government. Well, they obviously do not know their jurisdictions, do not know. They didn't have a mandate to do that. By and large, Canadians want to address climate action. They want to move forward. But we have this guy saying, well, if you don't like our oil program, you have spit all over Western Canada. Well, that's just a flat-out lie. It's a fabrication, but it has a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And just like I wrote on my blog about this whole closed culture thing, I see the same thing that happened to Quebec. And I was looking at the population growth in Quebec, and you can see a serious decline in growth when that referendum in 1995, when the referendum on separation was all the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Investment stops. People don't want to move there. People are leaving. And prior to that, there was kind of a consistent growth. And I look at Alberta and this election and Saskatchewan. I mean, we have agriculture that wasn't even talked about. And when you're talking climate, you've got to be talking agriculture. So we're all these family farms and the whole building of the provinces, they don't want to take responsibility for what they haven't done.
Mm-hmm.
And with Kenny, he's relatively new in his job in Alberta. But prior to Rachel Notley having only 4 years to start moving us in transition and choosing, environmentally friendly alternatives, diversifying, prior to that, we had 40 years of conservative rule in Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And we really never got answers to how our money was being managed. I mean, I ran an election in 2004, and I was bringing up these issues. Like, hey, we're not actually getting a fair deal for our oil. And everybody in the audience would be going, oh, we're landlocked. Like that was some kind of a light bulb moment.
That was the excuse.
Hello, North America, yes, this is how it works. But, the discussion over getting our oil to market, to new markets, anything other than dependent on the USA, was never discussed. It was like that was a taboo. Don't talk about it.
And to that point, I mean, a lot of people, we've heard, what's her name, Ms. Krause, talking about how, the Rockefeller Institute was undermining Western oil. But let's look at the reality here. And this is, and I hope we have Western listeners out here who are listening, because the fact of the matter is this. Alberta made the Koch brothers billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
Without Alberta, the Koch brothers would just be a couple of guys from the States whose family owned gas stations. The reality is 75% of the leases that were being held through the major boom times and even during the down times were being held by the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers were getting a premium on that oil. They weren't paying market rates. They were paying a royalty rate because, as you said, it's landlocked. Well, think about this from a business perspective, okay? Just as a business person. You own 75% of the leases. Right now, you're paying literally half the royalty rates you would be paying if the oil wasn't landlocked. Now, the only reason the oil is landlocked is because we can't get pipelines. Well, here's the thing. We can get pipelines into the States. We just got 2 more approved. We can get another extension on a pipeline to the West Coast as the federal government has just purchased. But here's the thing. Kinder Morgan said it, and the Koch brothers said it as well. There's no business model, no sound business model for them to move the oil to the West Coast. Now, people would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You're going to get a world price. Now you're going to make more money. But right now they're making money hand over fist because it's landlocked. Mm-hmm. They're going to actually lose money once it gets to the global market because now they have to compete. Currently, they own 100% of the market from where the exploration takes place, right from exploration to exploitation. They own 100% of the process. If it goes beyond the borders of Alberta, if it is no longer landlocked, now there's competition.
Yes, exactly. And there's no people are missing the point of actually looking beyond the headlines. And this is the thing that really irritates me is that immediately after the election, everyone always has different points of view, whether that you feel you won or you lost or your team won or you did, how you're going to benefit from this election. But when you stick a microphone in people's faces immediately in the heat of the moment, you're going to get various emotions. And what annoyed me is that it was so obvious that the very next day, the media had people lined up to talk about Western separation And how that didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen all of a sudden. These people all got together. No, this has been in the works for a long time.
That's right.
And the fact that the conservative government of the 40 years was wasting our money, our resources, and people don't want to look at that. I mean, there are people who do look at it and who do know, but there's a lot more that keep deflecting and saying, do not look at what happened in Alberta. Let's blame someone convenient. Oh, wait, you guys out here used to hate the father, so you naturally hate the son. And that is just, it's damaging, and it's eroding to our confederation. And the whole purpose of it, I failed to see a veteran who suits up to go to defend Canadian interests or to defend this nation who ever did it just for one province. And, people from all over this country stand together for a united Canada. And the reason we formed Confederation was because we knew there's resources in one area. There's, gold in Northern Ontario. When those mines became too expensive to mine, the people didn't say it's the federal government's fault. It was a reality of changing times. And just because people either were born in Alberta or came to Alberta to work or whatever, we don't own the oil. I mean, it's a human thing that you think, I live here, I own it. Well, it's just by where you were born that you actually have that benefit. But it's not, that's why Canada came together. We share the resources and we share the burdens. We don't fund the military individually, or, we fund it as a whole. We fund our social programs as a whole so that people have the freedom of movement. That's in our charter. I can be an Albertan today and I can move to Newfoundland tomorrow. And people from Newfoundland can come here when there's work and when there's, And so immediately after the election, you start hearing people who do not represent all of Alberta speaking out in very angry, abusive language, saying, certain people from other parts of Canada aren't welcome in Alberta because of the way they voted. And this, to me, speaks to the fact that in Alberta, we haven't had a true democracy for a long time. We have not welcomed different voices. If, running in an election, you really see it. I'd go to candidate debates and have people say, we don't want to hear from anybody but the Conservative.
Yeah.
Or we don't even want to hear the voice. We don't want to hear the idea.
No.
And that's why I say, these closed cultures are just regurgitating the same old stories. You're never going to get a new idea in that culture. And Albertans, yes, a lot of people do support the Conservative Party. Obviously, you can see that in the elections. But you can also see, if you look by riding, that a lot of people supported other ideas. We aren't this closed unit that they want us to be portrayed as. We are not the Wild West. And it's really, to me, it's rather insulting to have somebody like Jason Kenney, who was part of setting up the equalization payments in the first place. They were perfectly fine while he was in Ontario, but now he's in Alberta, and they're not fine. And that it's something that the federal government is doing to us. We're not victims. We're all these people sitting around waiting for the oil prices to come back because their government, the conservative mantra is, just wait, it's coming back, I'm going to get this for you. Well, people get angry in that position, and they're vulnerable to being exploited and looking for someone to blame for their hardships.
Well, and that's really what it comes down to, right? It is looking it's looking to put a blame on somebody, and it's this unwillingness, and I see this all the time with conservative elected governments, and it typically is conservative. So people out there going, "No, it's not just conservatives." No, you're right. It isn't just conservatives, but it is more typically conservative than not. They don't accept responsibility for anything they do. They blame, 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 but when it comes to accepting responsibility, they never accept responsibility. It's always someone else's fault. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more of my conversation. We're talking about Western alienation. When I come back, I want to talk about this bizarre notion of equalization and how, Alberta, people in Alberta send more money to Ottawa than any other province, and yet they get the least amount back. When we come back, listener, we'll talk about equalization. We'll be right back. My guest on the line is Catherine, Catherine Whelan. Very, very happy to have you here, by the way. Catherine Whelan Costen. I got to remember, if I get your name wrong, please remind me. We'll be back after the break, listener. Alrighty, everybody, welcome back. And I'm just trying to figure out why I'm just getting some of that feedback on here. Okay, so Catherine is still with us on the line. Thank you very much, Catherine. Before we went to the break, I was talking about equalization. I alluded to it. I read this really interesting piece earlier for the listeners. By the way, what I was reading you came from the Government of Canada, from the parliamentary website, parl.ca, and the site specifically, Parliament of Canada, Canada's equalization formula in brief. There's a preface here from Edison Awa Cesar, who's an economics resource and international affairs in Ottawa. He's one of the bureaucrats who put this up here. Look, here's the thing. I mentioned it before. I'm going to mention it again. Equalization's been around since 1957. Okay, we have only had universal health care and Canada pension plan in this country since about 67. So about 10 years later, we got this. So equalization's been around longer than universal health care. It's been around longer than the Canada pension plan. And it is a program that was created 100% and funded 100% from general revenues by the federal government. Now, this is general revenue based on per capita tax rates, whatever your tax rate. So if you are in an area of the country that earns more money, and you're paying more in taxes, then I guess theoretically you're sending more money to Ottawa. But there are more millionaires in Markham, Ontario than there are in the province of Alberta. I would assure you, listener, that the millionaires who live in Markham, Ontario are sending more money to Ottawa than the province of Alberta. Catherine, this argument that Alberta sends more money, you hear it from Jason Kenney, you heard it from Monty Solberg. I mean, how many Albertans out there do you think are actually buying into this narrative that Alberta sends all this money to Alberta or to Ottawa, and Ottawa just thumbs its nose?
Well, I actually do think there are a lot of people who buy it because it fits the narrative of we are victims and this is being done to us. Mm-hmm. And because it's been repeated so often, and the campaign that was launched as soon as Justin Trudeau became the Prime Minister, it started, and I really feel that there's an effort being made to divide, and if you think about it, when you divide people up, they're much easier to exploit.
Absolutely,
and you can absolutely exploit someone if they feel like they've been a victim. I mean, you just take a personal relationship, husband and wife, everything is going fine. Somebody else is witnessing them and says to one of them, "You're going to let that person treat you like that? That's not very nice. You shouldn't be, And all of a sudden it changes the dynamic. And he's looking around and saying, well, I thought we had a pretty good relationship here. But, that person says, mm-hmm. I'm not getting treated properly. I mean, it happens all the time. And it's the same thing, is this, when... Ralph Klein and prior to him, we had a lot of money. Nobody even paid attention. You try to ask them, where's our money going? Loan guarantees here, loan guarantees there that were failed, totally failed.
Corporate tax breaks.
And that's what we're having right now. Jason Kenney's giving the big corporate tax breaks while gutting social systems, mm-hmm. gutting education and healthcare funding, but he's funding certain elements of the education which happen to seem to have more of a religious flavor to them. And this is disturbing. This is disturbing because this is not, we have separation of church and state in Canada, mm-hmm. and that is where we look at how much money is being sent or not sent. We all pay taxes. What's done with it has to do with to ensure we all have a quality of life across Canada that is a bare minimum, basically.
Well, here's Jay Hill, a former Conservative cabinet minister, first elected as a reformer. Here's a guy who's gone full throttle Western separatist. He said, quote, I believe the first step is to hold a referendum and let people themselves decide once they know all the ramifications. There's a lot of reasons to be afraid. as there is to leaving an abusive relationship and seeking a divorce. This is the analogy we're hearing. So I do a lot of interviews with the director of the women's shelter locally here, okay, Cornerstone Family Violence Prevention Center. To hear an elected member of parliament refer to the relationship between the rest of Canada and one province, Alberta, as an abusive relationship and like seeking a divorce. I mean, talk about it. I mean, this is an insult to every victim out there that has ever had to leave an abusive relationship. And let's face it, Alberta is far from being abused. In the last 4 years, this federal government has done more for the province of Alberta than any government has done in a generation.
Yes, and this is gaslighting. This is a technique. This is exactly what's been going on throughout this election, and that's why a lot of people say this election has been the nastiest we've ever had. Now, the thing about it was that with all of the different moments where Mr. Scheer was found to have been lying or deceiving Canadians, there was media asked and then moved on, and then looked for something else to smear. One person, Justin Trudeau, not the Liberal Party, but one person. And that is disturbing because, I mean, even this whole thing about blackface, I was thinking about this. It's so bizarre to me that just recently the Canadian Opera is having to review their policy on blackface performances.
Because of Othello.
It is theater. It has been theater. The fact that, as with many things that we've come to know as normal, that people didn't know 20 years ago. If we don't know it today, 20 years ago, it definitely was not considered racist. And instead of that, should have been framed when those pictures were revealed, which they clearly were done to smear, without context. That is very bad journalism. That is to say, you know, in all fairness, this has been a theatrical performance. This has been done. The intent was not racist. They turned it around and tried to turn it into it. And I have to say, even Mr. Singh rode onto that bandwagon, which is rather sad because it's insulting to Canadians' intelligence. This is where I feel like we are being played. And the propaganda machine has been, the desire to get at Canadian resources has been there since the beginning. You know, that is why Confederation was formed, was to protect us from American capitalistic greed, lust for Canadian resources.
Well, exactly. And here's the other thing too, right? I mean, most Canadians who are paying attention already know this, but a lot of people in the West probably are not aware of this. I mean, most of the oil that we use in this country comes from the United States. Most of the oil that's at our gas stations comes out of the United States. The large majority, and a large proponent of that is, in fact, Western Canadian oil. But what Canadians aren't aware of, or maybe they're just not paying attention to the fact, that 75% of our oil is guaranteed to the United States of America. That's in the free trade agreement. They get three-quarters of our oil, and they get 50% of all of our natural gas. It's guaranteed. So when the Americans refer to Western oil as their oil, 75% of it is theirs. So, I mean, if we're going to if Alberta is truly upset with their relationship with the federal government, if I were, a legislator from Alberta, the first thing I would be screaming about is this guaranteed access to the United States of 75%, because they get to control the price and the market and how much is pulled out of the ground, where and when. And until people in Western Canada wake up to that reality, I mean, the fact of the matter is it's not Ottawa that is screwing over Alberta and Saskatchewan.
No.
It is the very people who have invested in the province, the very people who are pulling the oil out of the ground, the ones who are getting the less than 50% fee for royalty rates, the ones who've just seen their corporate taxes cut yet again. I mean, we are constantly subsidizing the oil and gas profits while we at the same time undermine the social integrity of the social security system that is in place to ensure that workers who do lose their jobs when the downturn happens, as is right now, are protected. I mean, let's remember what Stephen Harper said. I mean, no one likes to talk about, Harper was the last PM. Well, here's the thing. During the last federal election, not the one that we just had, but the one before that, the people of Alberta were asking the federal government to help them with employment insurance. Because don't forget, the oil downturn happened on the last year or so of the Harper regime. But what did Harper say? your province only represents 18% of our federal revenue. We are not going to jeopardize the other 80% to offer you guys a relief. I mean, he said this.
Well, the thing is that people want to try to, when I say that, I put quotes, conservative people want us to forget about Harper because they know he was so disliked by so many. But the thing is, he is still running the show, and his connection as leader of this International Democratic Union is behind Brexit in England, and there's no doubt about it. The same tactics are being used in Canada right now. Mm-hmm. The exact same gaslighting and telling people that, oh, these people are bad and they're your enemy and they're the reason for your situation. Well, they are not. We have a situation in Alberta in particular where we have had some very bad, mismanaged money and resources. And the fact that when the first free trade agreements came out, there were people who tried to object. And we were told that we were, just out to lunch. We didn't know what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And it was, Mr. Turner spoke out to Mr. Mulroney, and Mr. Mulroney turned it around and said, "You're saying I'm unpatriotic." Well, the fact of the matter was those trade agreements, when they started out, were selling out Canada bit by bit and control of our resources.
That's right.
The fact that people don't want to look at it, instead, it's become a reality TV show where we're talking popularity contest. I was waiting for the swimsuit competition to come because it was just getting to be so bizarre. I mean, why weren't we talking about policies truly? And when you think about in Alberta, the amount of money that's extension on the unemployment for people who lost their jobs, so they could make transition. It is not that different than the changes to, horse and buggy days. We have to evolve and adapt. And good leadership actually looks at the situation and helps its people to do that, to make those changes, to adapt. It's not saying that we're not going to stop using oil in the next 5 years, but we do have things that we can invest in to make things better. And in Alberta, we have agriculture that we could be having the biggest organic farms on the planet. We could be doing things and there are people who would like to live that way. When you look at the populations of Alberta in particular, the cities have the most population. The little towns, the rural areas that were part of more of a farming culture have been dying. There's no money for infrastructure. They're not even encouraging it in many cases because we have some big corporations that have bought up the land. So to be a good leader, you have to look at your whole situation. Alberta is not one industry, neither is Saskatchewan.
No, and that's why, again, this is something Rachel Notley was trying to do. Now, we're gonna go to a break, but before we do that, I want the listener to think about this for a second. There has been a $4 million budget created for an ad campaign to lure workers to fill thousands of empty Calgary tech jobs. That's right. Calgary's economic development plans to roll out a $4 million campaign to attract tech workers because, as CEO Mary Moran says, we have a shortage of tech talent. There's a real misperception of what's going on here. There's 2,000 to 3,000 jobs open. These are good paying, high quality, long lasting, career oriented jobs. They're not in the oil patch. Think about that. We'll be right back. Alrighty, everybody, and welcome back. Thanks to my guest, who has graciously agreed to join us for this hour, Catherine Whelan Costen. Before we went to the break, I mentioned the fact that in Alberta, in Calgary in particular, and probably the same is true in Edmonton, that they are crying for workers in their tech field. As many as 3,000 jobs are open up in Alberta in the tech hub of Alberta. Because don't forget, one of the things Rachel Notley did with the diversification and move away from oil and gas was to move towards a broader tech sector, but also to increase funding for a broader entrepreneurial spirit. How has that not taken off, Catherine?
Well, I think primarily because of the fact that there's so much propaganda. It's, Rachel Notley has really, she knew the heart of Albertans, and she knew our spirit to move forward. But when the constant dialogue is, it's just even from the ranchers around, it's about oil, and it's there isn't a open conversation about moving forward. It's as if to discuss anything else is some kind of sacrilege. And, I thought it was interesting. Heather Malick wrote a very good article in the Star today, and for your listeners, it's worth a look, talking about Jason Kenney missing the mark and setting Alberta up to fail. And he is. He's, some of the reports coming out now are the movie industry, the film industry is moving to Vancouver and Toronto out of Alberta. We have had so much of the television and movie industry working in Alberta over the years. To see that happen, that's thousands of jobs because of Kenney, not because of Trudeau, Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, sorry.
Well, and here's the other thing, too, because, again, this is, and to your point, because one of the things Jason Kenney did in this most recent budget is he took away the funding for tech industry, but he also took away the funding for the arts and funding that was being used to promote television and film work, like shows like Heartland, for instance,
Yes, exactly.
You took that money away.
Which speaks to the culture of Alberta, which speaks to the culture of Canada. That, this to me it comes down to two things. He's leading by greed and greed alone. And he's using his religious connection, the sort of a cloak, I'll say, of some kind of Christianity, which has absolutely zero to do with anything I ever heard Jesus Christ speaking, ever. I mean, his message was very clear. Love one another as I have loved you. That was it. No oppression, no keep people down, no stealing from other people or smearing them. None of that. That's coming from this whole group that is running in the background and telling us how we need to live. This is a desire to have, it speaks to the people who want to have power over other people in order to feel safe. It's the same kind of thing that we see when any new laws come in, that we build a cage around ourselves. We build our own cage because they hype us to believe that there's an enemy out there, that if we do not put laws in place to control those other people, we will not be safe. And that's the same thing that's happening with this divisive discussion that's about, Western alienation. If we had leaders who actually spoke of Canada with as much passion as they do about destroying her, we would have a whole different country from coast to coast to coast. It would never come down to this, where this divisive behavior. This would never have happened. But these people are not leading. They are trying to govern and dictate us. And that's a whole different ballgame. In a democracy where you have all kinds of views and ideas coming forward. I mean, when you think about these, in Edmonton, the numbers of people that came out for climate action, to talk to Jason Kenney, and he wouldn't even come out of the legislature to speak to them. It's like, I don't hear you, it's not happening. Well, it is happening, and people are aware. And my point about this whole climate situation is our climate is changing. Whether we caused it or we didn't cause it is really, it's not the major factor. The factor is we have to put things in place to adapt, or we're not going to thrive. And
well, and I'm so glad you said that, because I got into a bit of a conversation with a guy the other day. He's, so what? You're blaming man-made? It's a cycle, man. It's a cycle. Look, it may be a cycle to that point, but the reality is our human activity has made it worse. We have sped up the cycle. This guy's like, what do you expect human beings to do? Well, we can, to your point, adapt, change our behavior, maybe rethink how we move on a go forward, and let's reduce, reuse, recycle, rethink, all of those things, because we want to be able to continue to live on this planet. Like George Carlin said, the planet can shake us off like fleas if it wants to anytime. Yeah. It's not about protecting the planet. The planet's fine, thank you very much.
But if you want to have any of this new innovation, you have to educate people, not indoctrinate them. You have to have people who can think and visualize and imagine. I mean, Einstein was not indoctrinated. He was thinking outside of the box, and that's what you want your society to be able to do. How do we adapt? This is new. We've not been down this road before, so how do we do it? We sure don't do it by following heavy religious doctrine that is hell-bent on basically hell or heaven. And that's the whole thing. We didn't come to this planet to prove our worth for an afterlife. That if you're believing that, that's one thing. But for government to be talking like that,
well, this is it.
This is where it's off the.
Well, that's why I was shocked, because Jason Kenney has decided he's going to host his own prayer breakfast. I mean, I know there's been a 24-year ceremony in Edmonton for the mayor's prayer breakfast, but this, I mean, anyone who's ever watched that, there's a documentary called The Family, or
yes.
the Following, and I mean, it talks about this indoctrination, and it talks about how, we want to make sure that we have only Christian leaders, and, look, I don't have any problem with anybody's faith, okay? But, that's your personal faith. It's not my faith necessarily. We may share a faith. Who knows? But the reality is that's why there's a separation of church and state. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, well, America is a Christian country. Canada is a Christian country. The reason we don't have an official religion is because we aren't a religious state. This isn't the Vatican, No.
It's a multicultural society. And the thing about it is, I can freely get up today and go into any of the religious places. I can choose to belong to a community in the Jewish faith or the Christian faith, one of the churches. I can pick anyone I want to, and I can leave if I don't like what's being said. It's different if it's being legislated. Then we have a different problem. And then it becomes a religious state. And we all know it. I mean, look at Iran. Look at some of the other countries around the world that are fighting like crazy. The Taliban, for Pete's sakes. Where do you think this comes from? People embrace it when they are in fear, when they think they're not getting enough, and they think there's some kind of religious reason for it. And that's why it's promoted so much and not called on. Like, media is complicit in this because they have not exposed it for what it really is. No. And that is, a prayer rec is fine, go ahead, but what if you don't belong to that religion and you're an MLA? Do you go or you don't go? They're making money hand over fist on all of these propaganda machines. They have tons of money for that. And even this whole Western alienation, who's funding this? Why don't they put that money into building Canada, building the Western provinces, instead of, for Maclean's to do that story and having these premiers basically saying they're objecting to what the federal government, a duly elected, democratically elected government, and they're going to stand there and block it because we're going to do carbon tax, which is another thing that's interesting. The whole point of a carbon tax is to get people in thinking, just like we did with recycling. It changes our patterns.
Well, just like we did with smoking. I mean, one of the things
but the funny part is Kenny has just come out with a tax on smoking. And what the Alberta government said is this is a deterrent. Yep. Well, how can it be a deterrent for smoking but not for carbon?
Exactly. I mean, they've just proven the very fact that they're trying to deny, right?
Exactly my point. And there is so much propaganda. It's been going on for so long, and it is so easy when you live in Alberta and for, the 40-some years I've lived here, when you go to a place and you cannot speak because of your fear of being attacked because you don't have the same view, that's not very democratic, and that's the way it's been here for a very long time. So, when all of these candidate debates and things that just happened, I mean, when media is, all of our regional papers now are the same voice. So you're not going to get a different point of view. I mean, I know from firsthand experience from being at a candidate debate, participating in it, and then reading the newspaper the next day where they're talking about how great the Conservative candidate was, and they barely spoke. Because they didn't have to. And it used to be a joke around here. You could put a bale of hay with a blue button on it and people would vote for it. And that is true in the sense that they counted on that. But it's also very dangerous because it made the other voices silent because of fear. Because to speak out against it, even for me to speak out about what I see, I have to be very choosy about where I do that because people don't want to hear it. They want to hear there's one person to blame for all of our problems, And if we just removed him, that would fix it.
Exactly.
And they don't realize that they've got to examine what's happened in our government. We need the truth. I mean, when Mr. Prentice was elected, with Rachel Notley won the election as premier, and he had to step down. But he stepped down as the MLA. He didn't want to be even in government if he couldn't be the top dog.
Exactly.
But he shredded all of the previous, that 40 years of stuff, that information, that what did Rachel Notley have to go on? So there's a lot of propaganda going on, and we have to get media to get back to being neutral and
well, and they got to start asking follow-up questions. We're going to take our last break of the hour. When we come back, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank Catherine for being my guest. Catherine Whelan Costen. She is a writer, a producer. She is also a politician. She's been a politician in her past life, all around citizen of Alberta. We'll be right back, listeners. Alrighty, welcome back, and thanks again to Catherine. Catherine Whelan Costen. She is an author, online producer of her own online chat show, Exposing the Truth. Let's face it, we've spent the last hour doing just that. I guess really what we would like to see, or what I'd like to see anyway, is more people, asking tough questions. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's question everything. Let's make sure that when we get an answer, that it's something that can be empirically proven. I'm so tired of people with their false narratives and their lies. Catherine, what's the one last thing? If you could say one final thing to the listener out there, what do you hope?
I feel very much the same way. Open your hearts, open your minds. Don't accept whatever rhetoric is being told to you. Really do some research, and don't be afraid to look beyond what you've been reading. Look for other sources, because it's out there. The truth is out there, and we have to build Canada. That's right. One confederation from sea to sea to sea. Thanks. I'm going to